Yasuke, or Yasuke, was a man of African origin who served as retainer to Japanese daimyo Oda Nobunaga for a period of 15 months between 1581 and 1582 during the Sengoku period of Japan or Warring States period until Nobunaga's death in the Hanno-no-ji incident. There are just a few recordings of him in history and much speculation with some evidence, but the fact is there was a black man present in the setting of the most pivotal time in Japanese history. This is the story and an example shown to us in the dealings of race, caste, class, and placism. Yasuke, in Japan, August 17th, 1579 to June 21st, 1582. Current Japan, Sengoku period. Japan was at civil war on top of civil war. It was known as the Warring States period or country at war, the Sengoku period. China had become unified in 221 BCE, and Japan still had not done this, nor Africa. Thus, the war was named after this, the Warring States period. But who would rule was the question. There were records of battles of over 150,000 men. At this time, everyone in the East was under China because China controlled trade. In many Eastern languages, China is called the Central Kingdom or something alike. China was the high society and all of other Eastern societies beneath, even Japan. And all trade came from China. A reading from Thomas Lockley on the incident that made things worse. A civil war shook the Japanese islands. Just who the government was became increasingly unclear in the early 16th century. Two noble Japanese families arrived in China claiming the status, and the Chinese agreed to trade only with one of them, the Hosokawa. Those left out, the Ochi, were enraged and started a violent rampage in Chinese port of Ningbo, killing locals and plundering property. The Chinese were unsurprisingly not pleased with the foreign conflict spilling over into their own soil and demanded the perpetrators be delivered to them for justice. With no government in Japan able to enforce the Chinese request, nothing happened, and eventually the Chinese kept both trade and diplomatic ties with all of Japan. Japanese people were henceforth forbidden to enter Chinese territory on pain of death, and Chinese merchants would suffer the same penalty if they traded with Japan. China's allies in Korea also heightened trade relations and restricted Japanese traders to one port, Busan, in the southeast. Products that had previously been from China, either from China itself or traded through Chinese ports with destinations as far away as Africa, became hard to come by in Japan. Korean trade also dropped dramatically. Products which became scarce ranged from luxuries such as silk, tiger skins, art, oaks, ivory, and sugar to necessities such as coins, medicine, and tea. There were two solutions to this problem: piracy and finding other sources of trade. So the need and want for outside things grew. Enter the Catholics and the Europeans aiming at the Eastern world. Now remember, Portugal and Spain kicked the Moors out fully in 1491, and then after, they and the Dutch began to explore the world almost like they found maps of the world somewhere. The first affiliation between Portugal and Japan started in 1543 when Portuguese explorers landed in southern Japan, becoming the first Europeans to reach Japan. As soon as the first Portuguese arrived in 1543, Portuguese traders and merchants began looking for trading opportunities in Japan. This period of time is often entitled Nanban trade, where both Europeans and Japanese would engage in mercantilism and cultural exchange. The Portuguese at this time would found the port of Nagasaki. Because Japan was in the midst of a civil war called the Sengoku period, the Japanese bought many Portuguese artillery such as guns and cannons. Oda Nobunaga made extensive use of guns, playing a key role in the Battle of Nagashino. Within a year, Japanese smiths were able to reproduce the mechanism of Within a year, Japanese smiths were able to reproduce the mechanism and began to mass produce the Portuguese arms. Early issue dates of Japanese inexperience were corrected with the help of Portuguese blacksmiths. Pause. Now, what he's saying right here is the Japanese at first did not have guns. They got guns from the Europeans, And then instead of just keep buying them in their cannons, they learned how to make guns, and they even employed other Europeans who sold out and taught them how to make guns. That's one issue with Africa that never happened. We did reproduce in some areas. People reproduced like small cannons and guns, but never in mass production. Never was it the norm to actually start manufacturing weapons. That was one of the biggest mistakes, and still is to this day. Lack of manufacturing, and just all-around advancement. Just a historical note. Unpause. After the Portuguese first made contact with the Japanese in 1543, Japanese slaves were sold to the Portuguese and sent to various locations overseas, including Portugal itself, throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Documents mention the slave trade along with protests against the enslavement of Japanese initially issued by King Sebastian of Portugal to the Daimyo of Japan to stop the enslavement and transportation of the Japanese. Hundreds of Japanese, especially women, were sold as slaves. Japanese slaves are believed to be the first of their nation to end up in Europe, and the Portuguese purchased Japanese to bring to Portugal for sexual purposes, as noted by the church in 1515. King Sebastian feared that it was having a negative effect on trade between the countries and Catholic evangelization, since the slave trade in Japan was growing to large proportions, so he commanded that it be banned in 1571. Japanese slave woman was concubine serving on Japanese ships and trading in Japan, mentioned by Louis Sicaria, a Portuguese Jesuit, in a 1598 document. Japanese slaves were brought by the Portuguese to Macau, where some of them not only ended up being enslaved by the Portuguese, but also slaves to other slaves, with the Portuguese owning many Malay and African slaves who in turn owned Japanese slaves of their own. In 1595, a law was passed by Portugal banning the selling and buying of Chinese and Japanese slaves. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was so disgusted by his own Japanese people were being sold en masse into slavery in Kyushu that he wrote a letter to Jesuit Vice Provincial Gaspar Kelohu in July 24, 1587, and demanded the Portuguese, Thai, and Cambodians stop purchasing Japanese slaves and return those who ended up as far as India. Toyotomi Hideyoshi blamed the Portuguese and Jesuits for this slave trade. More on this later. Pause. Reader's note. Now, here we have an example of the Japanese being sold into slaves. So never think that just because Africans, black people were slaves. Everybody was slaves at one time, as Elon Musk stated, maybe except for the Dutch. But here's a clear example of people who were downtrodden. You think of the Japanese as this high society and all of this, and highway technologically, they had beautiful culture back then, but they were considered barbarians and savages by the Chinese and a lot of other people. They slave traded their own, they sold their daughters and their children. It was bad. It was bad. But look, they got shaped up, got out of it, and rose. Got smacked down and rose back up again. So don't ever think that, we can't do the same. Here's a clear example. Unpause, reader's note. So the Portuguese are aiming at the east, and now they set their eyes on Japan. And they need a man to handle the situation and get the trade routes together. They came in the vise, of course, we're bringing Christianity, goodwill towards men, yada, 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 and the one true living God. But secretively, the Portuguese Europeans wanted to just gain control of the trade industry and take over and get their influence the same way they wanted to do and did do in Africa. So enter their man, Alessandro Vallegnano. In comes Alessandro Vallegnano, born February 1539, died in January 20 of 1606. He was an Italian Jesuit missionary who helped introduce Christianity to the Far East, especially to Japan. Born into an influential Italian family and educated for the law, Vallegnano joined the Society of Jesus in 1566 after undergoing a religious experience. In 1573, the society appointed him to the Far East to help supervise the growth of its missions there. He arrived in Portuguese India in 1574 and spent most of the rest of his life in the service of missions to Gao, India, and Maku off the China coast and in Japan. Among missionaries he helped to prepare for work in China was the Italian Jesuit Matteo Ricci, who was responsible for the tremendous influence of Catholicism on the Chinese court in the 17th century. It was in Japan, however, that Villagnano made his major contribution to the proclamation of Christianity, and on his first visit he arranged for the Jesuit mission to receive a portion of the highly profitable silk trade between Japan and Maku. In this way, he not only made his mission self-supporting, but also was able to convert several other Japanese daimyos, hereditary feudal lords, who also helped to share in the trade. Villagnano's word, while it had a tremendous influence. By the time of his death, there were an estimated 300,000 Christians and 116 Jesuits in the country. At some point, he acquires Yasuke. Yasuke, the first black man in Japan. Thomas Lockley on Yasuke's origins. From putting Yasuke's origins in Africa is difficult. A secondary source, Salayer, who wrote about Yasuke in the 1620s, stated that Yasuke was from Mozambique. There was no other evidence for this, and no prior source mentions. The tribe in the immediate vicinity of the Portuguese-occupied island of Mozambique were called the Makua, a relatively peaceful agricultural people who had only migrated to the region in the 1570s until circa 1585. Long after Yasuke had left, they managed a relatively conflict-free coexistence with Europeans. While there were probably a few Maku slaves at Yasuke's time, the record is unclear, and the peaceful nature of relations makes it less likely that he was a Maku, as slaves would be more likely have come from a people unfriendly to the Portuguese. The possibility that he was sold because his family was in dire straits and he was an unneeded mouth to feed also exists. There were several families during the decade, but a family would normally sell a young child, not a strong young man. Another problem with this theory is that slaves preferred children. Slaves were preferred as children because they were easier to control and manipulate. Yasuke would have been 18 or 19 when Villagnano passed through Mozambique, late in the day to be enslaved. Finally, the Maku had a very distinctive culture of filing teeth in the points. This surely would have been a remarkable fact to the Japanese at the time and would probably have been mentioned. It is not. One final problem with the Mozambique origin story is that the Portuguese slaves trade in Mozambique was relatively small at the time. Only around 200 to 500 people a year were forcibly transported to India. Between 1500 and 1850, the total number of the slave people transported to India ocean destinations from Mozambique is estimated to have been between 40,000 and 80,000. The Arab, Jewish, Gorantani, and Turkish slave trade from Northeast Africa, by contrast, was far larger, and over the course of the history, an estimated 11 to 14 million Northeast African people were sold. And then there is the height and extremely dark skin. Neither are characteristic of the peoples of the Mozambique region, who generally smaller and have lighter colored skin. But the north of Africa integrated into the Indian Ocean slave trade provides the people who sound far more like our description of Yasuke, the Dinka, for example, from what is now known as the world's youngest state, South Sudan, are famously on average the tallest people in the world. They are also strong warriors who hold themselves well and are much darker skinned. All things said of Yasuke than their neighbors in modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, or Somalia. The Dinka are cow herders and fierce warriors who in the days lived slightly farther north of the current lands in the banks of the Nile. They partake of distinctive facial scarring upon reaching adulthood. A Yasuke would probably have been taken before his coming of age, rituals therefore lacked these features. Slave raiders from what is now northern Sudan also raided the Dinka people at this time. The Dinka people only got their modern name in the 19th century, probably after being randomly assigned by a British explorer or administrator. They called themselves the Zhang. Through a process of elimination, I have concluded that Yasuke was a member of the Zhang. And okay, read of note, that's not far-fetched. It could be Dinka. 6'2" by African standards is not that tall. I mean, you could have the people who are relatively 5'9", 5'10", and then pop up a 6'2" guy in Africa. So he could be from Mozambique, he could be thinking anywhere around the region. We don't really know, but he was probably taken as a slave as a young boy and then raised to be a slave soldier. Let's get into that pretty quick. The Arab slave trade on the time. The Arabs, this is another video I've done a few, maybe I'll do another few on the Arab slave trade in the future. But it was completely rampant from the time of Islam, the dying of the Prophet, and then pushing out the Arabs into Africa from the 700s on up till today. It was just, they were the main initiators of the African slave trade, or gearing it up in the process. Some things on this. Louis Feroz, a Jesuit priest, wrote of Yasuke as a kafir, slave in the Arabic. Cressat states that Yasuke was a servant brought from India with Alessandro Villanueva came to Japan. But most likely he converted to Islam and was sent to the caliphates of India. It is not known, however, whether Yasuke was enslaved or free at the time. Most likely he was already educated in war because he was Villanueva's bodyguard, purchased for justice reason. Most likely Yasuke was a Habishi, and that is slave trader and raised to be warriors in Muslim armies. Thomas Lockley on this very point. Habshi, slave soldiers, essentially became members of mercenary bands. The commanders were senior African generals who'd risen through the ranks to become men of wealth and power. It was they who brought the slave boys in the market and schooled their new recruits in the deadly arts. The training endured by the newly bought Habshi slave soldiers was brutal. The young man, as with child soldiers today, forced to kill and maim to become inured in the deeds that they had to soon carry out. This inoculated a fierce loyalty to the generals, their employers, and to each other. As outsiders in a foreign land, they had few other ties, and perhaps for Yasuke, becoming Habshi would have given him a sense of brotherhood and belonging. After the long and probable terrifying period of his life post-capture, he would finally have left secure again. With comrades, friends, and family and of sorts, military slaves were normally paid a salary, fed and clothed. They also had enjoyed spoils of war and generous bonuses, which boosted their loyalty further. Slaves were freed on their master's death, following as long a tradition, so many did not feel that slavery was a life sentence. They had a future beyond servitude. If they survived, many Habshi mercenaries are recorded as having been in Portuguese service. For example, 600 formed a defensive force in the constantly beleaguered Portuguese fort of Du, 180 miles north of Mumbai, and many others worked as sailors on Portuguese ships. End. Part 3. Introduction to the King. My new best black friend. As soon as Villanueva came to Kyoto with Yasuke, all the town wanted to see him. I quote from the time of the Chronicles of Lord Nobunaga by Shincho Koki. Second month, 23rd day, March 27th, 1581. A black monk came from the Christian countries. He looks about 26 or 27 of age, and his entire body is black as a cow. His body is really well built, and furthermore, he has a strength of over 10 men. A padre, a priest, brought him here to see Lord Nobunaga. I am grateful to be able to see such rare things among the three countries that have never been seen before, and in such detail, all thanks to Lord Nobunaga's great influence. Recorded from the European side. Letter from Louis Feroz, April 14th, 1581. Monday after Easter, Nobunaga was in the capital, but a great number of people gathered in front of our posa to see the Kafre, or black slaves, creating such a ruckus that people were hurt and almost died from rocks thrown. Even though we had lots of guards at the gates, it was difficult holding people back from breaking it down. They also say if we show for money, one would easily earn in a short time 8,000 to 10,000 crozado. Nobunaga also wanted to see him. and so sent for him. So Padre Orientanil brought him. With great fuss, he couldn't believe this was a natural color and not by human needs, so ordered him to take off all his clothes above his belt. Nobunaga's sons also called him over, and everyone was very happy. Nobunaga's nephew, the current commander of Osaka, also saw him and was so happy he gave him 10,000 coins. So, the black man's fortune has turned. As soon as he set foot there on another land, from just another slave to a celebrity at once, Ing even exulted over the priests who were his owners or superiors. Nobunaga began to have conversations with Yasuke. As he could speak a little Japanese, he took a great liking to the man. Lord Nobunaga then, through most likely an offer the priest couldn't refuse, he purchased or received Yasuke to be his bodyguard or sword-bearer. Sword-bearer was a great honor. Imagine being the bodyguard of the King of England. More records on this. The Japanese side, Matsudairi Giyadi's diary, May 11, 1582, day of Tetbai. It's raining. His Highness gave him a stipend. They say the Jesuits presented him. He had the black band with him. His body was black like ink, 6'2" feet tall. They said his name's Yasuke. And perhaps the Europeans were not happy on this matter. A letter from Lorenzo Messiah, October 8th, 1581. The priest brought one of the Kafirs with him, and no one in the capital had seen him before, and they all admired him. Countless people came to see him. Nobunaga himself saw him and was surprised, and thought it was painted with ink, and did not believe he was black from birth. He sees Nobunaga now from time to time, and he knows some Japanese, so he never got tired of talking to him. And he was a strong one and knew some tricks, so Nobunaga was very happy. Now he's his strong patron, and to let everyone know, he has someone show him around the city, but people say Nobunaga will make him a kano, a gourd. And so right here, I'm Iwan. You can almost hear the animosity at the end of their voice through that text. A slave, a black man, has surpassed us all. Europeans and may even become a lord here? Blasphemy. Further animosity between the two groups is legitimized by the fact that the entire time there is no mention of Yasuke communicating or even going back to the priest willingly, which begs a point: did he want to leave his previous masters? More on the acquisition of the black man. 2 points could also be fueling Nobunaga's wanting of the black man. 1. This showed Nobunaga could produce things from outside the world to his people as recorded in the Chronicles of Lord Nobunaga by Shincho Koki. And 2. It is possible that the huge uproar to the response of an actual black man is that of the Japanese legends of Oni. Oni are depicted as orange, blue, and brown, and very large and scary. So the thought may have been Lord Nobunaga has an Oni. More greatness to the name of the true ruler of Japan. And so, an Oni is a demon, so it would be like a president coming through with a vice president with wings or something. You know, think it's an angel, so it's part of their myth already that a dark, large, scary, mythical creature. And Lord Nobunaga now has this large, scary, dark creature. And it was shocking. And you could see why Nobunaga would want this. Maybe there was some other things, some actual attraction or whatever, but there was a reason and a need for Nobunaga to want Yasuke. You have a 6'2" black man as a bodyguard. It's very scary. Very scary that you've never seen a black man, and you see a large 6'2" one, and the average man is 5'8", and you have this sitting next to you. people would shriek, people would be scared, and then, people actually greeted Yasuke and been happy about it, so it was also a positive thing. This was a man leaving a world where black is evil and terrible, from the European and the Muslim world into the East, and he's now a free man exalted. He's a hero, a rock star. This had to be great, and this had to be a whole nother world, and then priests were most likely upset about that and did not like that. Thoughts? And the battles. Some people say Yasuke was not in the battle. So let's look at the record. The battles while Yasuke was employed by Lord Nobunaga. February 3rd. The Odo army, led by Megeboshi Mori, departed from Gifu Castle and entered Shinano province, via the Kingoshi and Inakado roads. The frightened lords of the surrounding areas surrendered to the Oda army one after another. Additionally, Mount Ashima erupted on February 14th. The eruption of Mount Ashima was originally feared as a sign of something terrible or bad happening, and the morale of the Takeda clan declined greatly, causing even more people to defect to the Oda army. February 16th. The Takeda army, led by Imafuku Masaya Kazu, and the Oda army led by Chiso Hiyoshimasa clashed in Pori Pass. The Oda army is victorious. February 18th, Oda Nobunaga Obo Nobutada invaded Ida. Maru Hoshingin, the lord of the castle, fled to Takato Castle, and Kateyoryu's uncle, Noburono Takiba, who learned of this, also set fire to Oshima Castle, which was a key point in the war, and he fled. And so whether Yasuke was at those battles is not clear, but for sure he was employed while Nasu battles are going on. So as a military man himself, which he most likely was as a bodyguard, him going on a campaign with another general was not far-fetched at all. So could we say he's in the battles other than the final? Yes. Would you say the man was employed by the Lord and he went into battle? Most likely. At least once. It was bad in Japan at this time. It was popping. There were so many clans against so many clans, there was anarchy. There were battles and wars everywhere, so he just stepped foot on the landmine. It'd be like, it's going into a Middle Eastern horde zone somewhere. So, that's more likely illogical that he wasn't in battle.